The HOA president actually called the local sheriff on me for swimming in my own backyard lake, a lake I'd owned and loved for 15 years before her plastic subdivision was even a flicker in a developer's eye. And honestly, standing there dripping wet on my own dock while being told I was trespassing on my own property was the exact moment I realized some people won't stop until they've sucked the soul out of everything beautiful. You have to picture this. It's sunset in rural North Carolina, the kind of evening where the air smells like damp pine and wood smoke, and I'm just floating there watching the loons dive when suddenly these blue and red lights start slashing through the trees like a neon blade, and out steps Sheriff Deputy Miller looking like he'd rather be anywhere else on God's green earth. And right behind him, standing on the very edge of my property line, is Brenda Vance. Now, Brenda is the kind of woman who wears white linen in the middle of a forest and has a smile that looks like it was applied in a dental lab. Perfect, cold, and completely devoid of human warmth. And she's standing there with her arms crossed over her designer chest, nodding like she's just successfully defended the border from an invading army. Miller looks at me and says, in quote, "Arthur, I'm sorry, man, but she's filed a formal complaint under the new restricted water usage ordinance. And I've got to issue the citation," end quote. And I'm just staring at this piece of paper for a $1,000 fine for, end quote, unauthorized recreation, end quote, in a lake my grandfather helped dig with a borrowed backhoe back in the 50s. I tried to explain. I told her, end quote, "Brenda, I built this dock with my own two hands while you were still selling overpriced condos in Scottsdale. This is private water," end quote. But she just gave me that little tilt of the head, that patronizing look you'd give a stray dog, and said, end quote, "The community standards apply to the entire watershed now, Arthur. We have to protect the aesthetic integrity of Pine Crest Estates," end quote. And she just turned on her heels and clicked away across the gravel. What she didn't know, and what she really should have checked before she started this war, was that before I retired to this cabin to try and find some peace after losing my wife, Martha, to a 3-year battle with cancer, I spent nearly 3 decades as a forensic auditor for the state's municipal finance department. I spent my entire career sniffing out the kind of people who think they're smarter than the rules, the kind of people who hide their greed behind fine print and fake smiles, and Brenda Vance was about to find out that the, end quote, grumpy old man in the cabin, end quote, was actually her worst nightmare with a high-speed internet connection and a library card. You see, after Martha passed, the silence in our old city house was so loud it felt like it was crushing my ribs. So I moved out here to my family's land, for acres of pristine woods and a spring-fed lake that's as clear as gin, because this was the only place I could breathe without feeling like I was suffocating on memories. It was peaceful for a while, just me and the trout and the wind in the hemlocks, until a developer bought the logging tract to the north and threw up 45, end quote, modern farmhouse, end quote, mansions that all look like they were cut from the same piece of expensive cardboard. Brenda moved into the biggest one, the, end quote, Grand Willow, end quote, model, and within 6 months she had maneuvered herself into the HOA presidency and started her, end quote, beautification, end quote, campaign, which mostly involved sending me letters about the, end quote, unacceptable rustic nature, end quote, of my woodpile and the fact that my 1994 Ford F-150 was an, end quote, eyesore, end quote, when parked in my own driveway. I ignored her for as long as I could, but the swimming fine was the line in the sand, or the water, I guess, and when she tried to claim my lake was, end quote, communal aesthetic property, end quote, while charging me for the privilege of looking at it, I decided it was time to go back to work. A few days after the sheriff visit, a guy named Gary shows up in a generic white truck with a clipboard, claiming to be, end quote, watershed inspector, end quote, from a private firm hired by the HOA, and he tells me that because my lake connects to the subdivision's drainage, I'm now subject to a, end quote, pollution mitigation fee, end quote, of $400 a month. Gary had that look, you know the one, the shifty eyes of a guy who's used to selling extended warranties for things that don't exist, and when I asked to see his credentials, he got all blustery and started talking about, end quote, environmental liability, end quote, and, end quote, emergency board mandates, end quote. I've sat through enough budget hearings to know a shakedown when I see it, so I let him talk. I even let him take photos of my septic tank, but the whole time I was noting the lack of an official county seal on his paperwork. That night, I stayed up until 3 a.m. digging through the state's business registry and the county's archive planning maps. And what I found made my morning coffee taste like pure victory. Not only was Gary's firm not registered to perform environmental inspections in this state, but the company's mailing address was a P.O. box registered to a shell corporation owned by Brenda Vance's brother-in-law. It was a classic kickback scheme, a little family business funded by the dues of 45 unsuspecting homeowners who were too busy working their corporate jobs to realize their HOA president was treating their bank accounts like her personal piggy bank. But that was just the appetizer, because when I started looking at the actual land surveys from when Pinecrest was built, I found the nuclear option tucked away in a 1991 forestry easement that the developers had conveniently forgotten to mention in the property disclosures. It turns out that a 20-foot strip of land running right through the middle of the subdivision, including the land under Brenda's massive pool and half of her neighbor's 3-car garage, was actually designated as a permanent state conservation buffer for migratory birds. They'd built on protected land without a permit, likely by greasing a few palms in the old zoning office. And the penalties for that kind of violation are enough to make a billionaire weep. I could have just reported her then, but Brenda decided to turn up the heat by filing a nuisance injunction against me, claiming that my evening swims were disturbing the peace and that the sound of my old radio, which plays nothing but 40s jazz at a low volume, was psychological harassment for the neighborhood children. She even went as far as to call a local news on your side segment, trying to frame me as this unstable hermit who was endangering the local ecosystem. And I'll never forget the look on her face when the reporter turned the mic to me, and I just calmly pulled out a folder of certified water tests and the expired business license of her brother-in-law's company. I didn't oppose. Raise my voice. I didn't oppose. Get angry. I just spoke with that flat, auditor's tone that says, I have the receipts and you're finished, and you could actually see the sweat starting to break through her expensive foundation under the camera lights. She tried to cut the interview short, claiming legal privilege but the damage was done, and the next morning my gravel driveway was full of neighbors I'd never spoken to before. People like Janet, a retired schoolteacher who'd been fined for her bird feeder, and Mark, a guy who was being threatened with a lawsuit because his lawn was half an inch too long. They were scared, they were frustrated, and they finally had someone who knew how to fight back. I realized then that this wasn't oppose just about my lake anymore. It was about a whole community being held hostage by a narcissist with a gavel. So I hired a high-end property attorney named Silas, who looks like a friendly grandfather but has the killer instinct of a great white. Silas found the final piece of the puzzle, pre-existing boundary clause, in the original county charter, which stated that any property over 3 acres that shared more than 500 feet of a border with a residential development had the legal right to, involuntary annexation, for the purposes of voting oversight if the development's actions affected the primary property's value. In plain English, I could force my way into their HOA, and because my land was so much larger than their tiny quarter-acre lots, the, weighted voting, system they designed to keep themselves in power was about to backfire spectacularly. My 4 acres gave me the equivalent voting power of 12 houses, and when I teamed up with Janet, Mark, and the 15 other families who were tired of Brenda's tyranny, we held a combined 52% of the voting shares. The night of the emergency board meeting was something out of a movie. I'm telling you, it was held in the community clubhouse, which smelled like expensive air freshener and suppressed rage, and Brenda was sitting at the front table king like a queen about to deliver a death sentence. She started the meeting by trying to, expel, the visitors, but Silas stood up and dropped a stack of notarized annexation papers on the table that sounded like a gunshot in the silent room. Mr. Henderson is now a voting member of this association, Silas said, and we have a motion to introduce an immediate forensic audit of all contracts over $5,000, Brenda went pale, then red, then a weird shade of purple, and she started screaming about, illegal interference, harassment, but the neighbors started standing up one by one, clapping and demanding to see the books. It was a mutiny in business casual. We spent the next 3 hours systematically dismantling her empire. We presented the evidence of the shell company, the illegal construction on state-protected land, and the fact that she'd been using HOA funds to pay for her own personal landscaping and, in quote, security, in quote, which was just Gary in the white truck. The best part was when I stood up and looked her dead in the eye, and the room got so quiet you could hear the hum of the refrigerator in the back, and I said, in quote, "Brenda, you wanted to control the water on my property, but you forgot that water always finds the cracks in a bad foundation, and yours is crumbling." End quote. We held a vote right then and there, a vote of no confidence, and we removed the entire board, replacing them with Janet as president and Mark as treasurer. And the first thing the new board did was vote to reimburse me for every single fine, with interest, and to permanently delist the lake from the HOA's, end quote, aesthetic zone, end quote. But I wasn't in oppos. Done, because remember that $5,000 I mentioned? Well, the forensic audit revealed that Brenda had misallocated nearly $250,000 over 3 years, and under the HOA's own bylaws she had written, any officer found guilty of, end quote, gross financial negligence, end quote, was personally liable for the cost of the audit and the restoration of the funds, plus a 20%, end quote, administrative penalty, end quote. When we totaled it up, her share of the recovery costs came out to exactly $5,000 per household in the subdivision, a debt that was legally attached to her property as a lien. I didn't in oppos. Just raise her fees. I made it so that her own greed legally compelled her to pay back every cent she'd squeezed out of her neighbors, plus a massive premium for the trouble she'd caused. A few weeks later, I watched from my dock as a U-Haul backed in her driveway, because with the state forestry department breathing down her neck about the illegal pool and the massive debt she owed the HOA, she had no choice but to sell a loss and run back to wherever people like her come from. The, end quote, lakeside luxury, end quote, signs were taken down, replaced by a simple wooden one that just said, end quote, Pine Crest, end quote, and for the first time in years, the loons were the only ones making noise at sunset. Now, I know some people say I went too far, that I should have just let the lawyers handle it quietly. But you have to understand, people like Brenda Dawn and oppos, learn from, end quote, quiet, end quote. They only learn when they lose the power they use to hurt others. I'm back to my evening swims now, and sometimes Janet or Mark will come down to the dock with a few beers, and we'll just sit there and watch the trout jump. And it feels like Martha's spirit can finally rest easy again because the land she loved ISN and oppos, end quote, restricted zone, end quote. Anymore, it's just home. But it makes me wonder how many other people are out there right now, sitting in their houses, terrified of a letter in the mail from someone with a little bit of power and a lot of ego? Is it ever really possible to truly own your land in this country? Or are we all just one, end quote, amended ordinance, end quote, away from being trespassers on our own soil? I'd love to know if any of you have dealt with end quote, Brenda, end quote, in your life, or if you think I was the one who crossed the line here. Because from where I'm sitting, the water feels just fine, but the world sure has a way of trying to make it cold for everyone else. Drop a comment and tell me, did I win the war, or did I just become the very thing I was fighting against? I'll be here, by the lake, waiting to hear what you think.